One of the biggest mistakes that I often see in my students' database when I analyze their game is that they have an extremely low check raise frequency in a single raise pot out of position as the pre-flop aggressor. Now today I want to jump into this specific topic and give you guys some tips and tricks on how to increase that low check raise frequency, and also why it's important to make sure that you check raise enough often. So guys, if you like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Give the video a thumbs up and also check out the PLO Mastermind. If you want to learn more about pot limit Omaha strategy, then head over to plomastermind.com. I brought a hand history with me, and this is a hand that one of my students played in the past. This is a 9-8-3 board in a single raise pot where my student is out of position and he's sitting in middle position versus the cutoff. Now, my student flops very strong, of course. Top pair, a rep, backdoor flush draw, and the question is, do you want to see bet or do you want to check? Now, before answering the question of this specific hand, I like to zoom out a little bit and think bigger picture. Whenever you are in any poker situation, really, what is extremely helpful to do is not right away think about your exact combination, but zoom out and think, how is your overall range playing on a certain board? And if I would ask you, how often would you see bet on 9-8-3 rainbow in a single raise pot out of position? Would that be 10 or 20%, maybe 40, 50%, or maybe even more? Like, what is it that you would do in a situation like this with your overall range, right? Not with this specific combination. Because whenever you know the answer to that question, it often helps you to have a much easier decision with your specific hand. On 9-8-3 rainbow, for example, we are only supposed to see bet roughly 12%. And that frequency is of course very low and much lower than you would often see in other parts of the game. Now, whenever the c-bet frequency is that low, let's say 12%, it is a good idea, in my opinion, to simplify your strategy and just check your entire range and not bother about those few combinations that you could potentially c-bet with. Now, by checking your entire range, you are making sure that you are checking a lot of your, or basically all your very best hands as well, that are now being put into your checking range. And when your opponent takes a step, you are able to check raise a lot of your best hands because all those hands are still in your checking range. Now, in a situation like this, where the c-bet frequency is only 12%, you have to realize that that frequency is actually holding true on a lot of different board textures. There are actually only a few exceptions to the rule of checking with a super high frequency out of position, and that is when the board is ace high or when you're playing small blind versus big blind. In those situations, the out of position player has such a large range advantage or is doing so well that he can allow himself to do a lot of c-betting. But on almost any board texture, whether it's king high or 9 high or 7 high, what you often see is extremely low c-bet frequencies and sometimes even full range. And in those situations, I would suggest to simplify your strategy and just check always. Now, the reason why the out of position player wants to check so often on the majority of these board textures is because when you think about ranges in play and how they interact to a certain board texture, the out of position player is not holding a range advantage on most of these textures. And because that is the case, he ends up having a lot of medium strong hands. And medium strong hands generally don't want to inflate the size of the pot, so they're going to check in the hope their opponent checks back to keep the pot small. But whenever that is the case, whenever we decide to do a lot of checking with all those medium strong hands, we have to make sure that we're also checking a lot of very strong hands in order to be able to fight back when our opponent decides to bet. We have to check raise enough often for our opponent to not have a very profitable stab in position because he knows that he simply doesn't get check raised. So we're checking all those medium strong hands, and on top of that, we will add in the majority of our very best hands as well into that range, so we can fight back versus a bet. And that leaves us with a range that primarily wants to check. And keep in mind that if you're out of position and you have to act first on all the streets, you are in a large informational disadvantage, right? Your opponent knows more about you than you know about your opponent, simply because you're acting first. And imagine c-betting boards like 9-8-3. A lot of the strong hands on the flop, they won't be as strong anymore by the time we are on the river. The nuts is going to change from flop to turn and from turn to river relatively often. And that leads to a situation where if you're out of position, you cannot comfortably barrel on a lot of the runouts because, again, you have to act first. You don't know yet whether your opponent improved on a straightening turn or a pairing turn or a flushing turn. We don't know that, so we end up doing a lot of checking. Now, going back to the initial idea of we are checking our entire range, let's say, on this board texture, because we're overall only c-betting 12%, and we learned that in a situation like this, we can simplify it to just check everything. Now, what that does is, if we check, we are sure that all our best hands also fall into our checking range. And whenever that is the case, and we know that our opponent in position will generally stab roughly 50% of the time, that is quite an average, normal frequency people stab with in position. We know, because we add in all our strong hands as well, that we are able to fight back enough often by check raising. And it's important to have enough check raises in our range, right? Because if we don't, the in position player can simply take a stab in position, knows he doesn't get check raised, and if he doesn't get check raised, he has a very profitable stab in position. He can add in way more medium strong hands sort of to stab with in position, which are hands that he often not want to inflate the size of the pot with because he can get check raised, and that's not something that he wants to risk, right? So by not having a high check raise frequency, the in position player can stab way more often and first of all realize a lot of fold equity. And secondly, he knows that he never gets check raised, so he can realize his equity also very profitable. He can just stab, let's say, half pot, and he knows by stabbing half pot that he will see a turn. He basically also buys a river right away because the out of position player simply will check most of the time, always on the turn. So he will see a turn and a river for a half pot size stab, and that's a very profitable situation to be in. And for us as out of position, we have to counter that strategy by making sure that we find enough check raises. Now, what we see and what we learned is that having enough check raises is important, and it's a way to fight back against our opponent. And secondly, it's a strategy we can execute quite easily almost if we make sure that we check all our strong hands on the flop in the first place. Now, when we think about our check raise frequencies, it often is the case that these frequencies should hover between like 10 to 15%. That is quite a normal, and that's sort of a normal frequency that you should be aiming for. While what I see with most of my students, for example, is that that frequency often hovers around like 5%, 6%, sometimes a little bit higher, but generally that's about it. And we know then that he's not check raising enough. On top of that, people also check fold too often, generally speaking. And because people check fold too often, we give again our opponent more incentive to do a lot of stabbing. And if we give him a lot of opportunities to stab profitably, again, we have to make sure to counter that by check calling enough often, and on top of that, check raising enough often. So our opponent is not incentivized to do a lot of stabbing with sort of that medium strong part of his range. If we check raise all our very best hands, or a lot of our very best hands, of course, we will check call some of those combinations because we want to protect our check calling range. We also have to make sure that we check raise bluff some hands, right? And what you want to think about when you check raise bluff is that you want to stack multiple blockers against your opponent's bet continuing range, while at the same time having a hand that can deal with turn and river transitions in a reasonable way. You want to be able to improve by improving to a better made hand, or to turn like really strong blockers on which you have a very profitable bluff. So for example, on a board texture like this, I can imagine a hand like ace 10-10-9 being a very good check raise bluff. The 10-10-9 combination is blocking our opponent's best made hands, top set and top two pair. Well, at the same time, if you have 10-10, you can barrel off on a lot of the straightening runouts and pretend that you have a straight. So if a 7 rolls off, you have a very profitable double and triple barrel bluff after you check raise. And that is a general idea that you should keep in mind. So check raise a lot of your very best hands in order to build a pot, to lower the positional disadvantage, because that is what naturally will happen. The SPR shrinks down significantly, and whenever the SPR shrinks down, the out of position player benefits from that because he is in a very large disadvantage in a high SPR situation. So we want to lower the SPR. And on top of that, we want to build a pot, right? For us as the out of position player, keep in mind that by checking and going for the check raise, you can build a much larger pot than if you just c-bet. Let's say you would c-bet here, let's say 6 big blind. Well, you can increase the pot by 6 big blind. But if you check and your opponent stabs, let's say 4.5 big blind, you can then check raise to, let's say 16 big blind. And now suddenly you're increasing the size of the pot significantly more with your very best hands. So you can build the pot much stronger with the top of your range. And there's a lot of additional benefits, right, that we already covered. So it's all coming together by the end of the day, in a sense that we want to do a ton of checking with our best hands. And on most of these textures, we can simplify it to just check our entire range. And if our opponent then stabs, we know first of all that, hey, we have all those very good hands in our range. So on this board, we have still all our 9-9, 8-8, pair plus reps. All those hands are still in our range that we can check raise. So we know we have enough check raises for value. Then the next question is we want to add in some check raise bluffs. So we can check raise a couple of, like, let's say bear reps. We can check raise some 10-10-9 combos, 10-10-8 combos, maybe some gutters with a pair blocker that are check raise folding, of course, but do have some equity in case they get called. And more importantly, they generate fold equity because they are blocking your opponent's bet continuing range. Okay, so guys, that is it for this episode. This hand, my student did check and decided to go for a check raise. And with this specific holding, that's a great decision. I mean, of course, you can go for a c-bet, right? It doesn't mean that a c-bet is necessarily super bad. But what more important is to keep in mind is that on this texture, our range only bets 12%. So let's simplify our strategy. Check everything. And then if we face a stab, let's check raise hands like this. Build a pot, push our equity advantage with our hand. If the money goes in, it's fine. And if not, that's also good, right? Again, single raise pots out of position, very often a spot that is misplayed by a lot of people. And I do recommend all of you guys to, if you have access to your database maybe, then head in there, check what your check raise frequency is, and let me know down in the comment what it is. And more importantly, what you're going to do to maybe improve on that. Let me know if you liked this video, this content. Give the video a thumbs up if you do. Also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And I hope to see you guys soon for another episode. Guys, good luck at the table and let's crush it.